Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am pleased to talk today with Rafe Sagarin, who is going to be our new environment editor for Evolution, This View of Life. But such is the nature of the magazine that we were also considering him for the politics editor. And Rafe's, both of our colleagues, Dominic Johnson, is going to be the politics editor. But that just shows you the crossover that exists for Evolution, This View of Life. So first, Rafe, welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for agreeing to be editor. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to study both politics and the environment from an evolutionary perspective.
Well, I'm a marine ecologist, and I've always had an interest in environmental politics, and my career has always oscillated between field-based science and the political and policy implications of that science. And what I like to say is that as an ecologist, it's interesting, for most of my career, evolution was sort of this known quantity that just existed lurking in all of my research. It was sort of the accepted norm, but I hadn't really delved into evolution until my real big political stint was working for Congresswoman Hilda Solis as a science advisor, as a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow, right after 9/11, and I started seeing all the security infrastructure being built up. And it struck me how completely unadaptable this security infrastructure was. So you had, new security barriers everywhere and new security guards, but the process was just put something up and then leave it there. It didn't change at all. And then I really started thinking, wow, what can evolution tell us about adaptability and how, terrorists might adapt to these kind of things. And as I did that, I realized, wow, I've been a biologist all my career, but I really don't know enough about evolution and its implications for society. Even though in the early days of ecology, all of this was connected. Evolution, ecology, society, it was all one thing. It's kind of been separated out, and now I think we're in this really exciting time where all of this is coming back together. The policy side of things, the ecology side of things, the evolution side of things. So I think it's a really exciting time to be involved in a project like This View of Life.
That's what makes you such a great choice for editor. Well, I'm sure a lot of our readers think a lot about the environment, but don't necessarily know what evolution has to do with it. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about why an environmentalist might need to also be an evolutionist.
Yeah. I guess it's sort of taking on that Dobansky quote of
nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Thank you. I know you'd have that ready at hand. And, I think that's the same is true of the environment, because everything that we're seeing, especially now in the environment where we can have such an impact, will also affect adaptational systems and will affect the evolution of organisms, including the evolution of humans, as we go forward. And there's numerous examples of this. You can pull out just things like seeing that overfishing off the top end of food chains and also off the large end of the size spectrum, which is what we tend to do. We tend to select large things, is leading to evolution of species. So there's an evolutionary response.
So just to emphasize that, an extremely important message, which will be coming through in piece after piece on Evolution, This View of Life, is that evolution takes place on ecological timescales. A single generation can be enough, and
Absolutely.
If it's generation after generation after generation, the species that we interact with are changing before our very eyes. And guess what? That includes us, the human species. So this is part of what's going to be reported on Evolution, This View of Life.
Other fascinating interactions are things about emerging infectious diseases and relationships to biodiversity. Does that enhance or decrease the opportunities for diseases to skip the animal-human boundary and become pathogenic to us. It's just everywhere you look in environmental issues. Obviously, genetically modified organisms is a big issue in a lot of environmental circles, and there's a lot of trade-offs when you start talking about GMOs, and there's also a lot of unknowns in terms of how the larger gene pool around fields planted with GMOs are going to be affected. So almost every issue we see that has an environmental bent likely has an evolutionary bent. One of the things that hasn't been discussed too much, I think, to the detriment of both science and public discussion is evolutionary adaptation in relationship to climate change. So, there's a lot that goes on with climate change experiments, for example, that don't really take into account how are organisms going to adapt to climate change from an evolutionary standpoint. Like you say, that can happen fairly quickly. And so our assumption that the organisms in a climate change world are going to be just like the organisms now, but maybe they've moved their ranges or something like that, isn't completely correct, because they are also going to adapt to different climate cycles, different phenological cycles, that kind of thing. So,
yep, absolutely. Well, in their brief introduction, let me feature two of your own new projects. And first of all, congratulations. I hear that you just received a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is a great honor.
Thank you.
And so you have two books that you're working on, which will appear in 2012. One is called Learning from the Octopus, and the other is called Observation and Ecology. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what these evocative titles are about?
Well, Learning from the Octopus really came out of this Adaptation and Security project that I mentioned. And what it is it's a book intended for a general audience to understand what we can learn from biological adaptation for security in society. And the basic premise is that all organisms on Earth have the same problem that we have, no matter what security problem we're talking about, whether it's terrorism, natural disasters, emerging infectious diseases, cybersecurity. The problem is that there is always going to be risk in the environment. We can't eliminate it. I like to say sharks don't try to turn fish into vegetarians. Fish don't try to turn sharks into vegetarians. They know that there's predation out there, and that risk is generally completely unpredictable. And so how do we deal with that? That's what we struggled with for years in the security field. Organisms in nature have dealt with it for billions of years. And there are millions and millions of successful examples of how you live in a world that's full of risk, and that risk is unpredictable. And how you do it is by being adaptable. And then we get into what are the characteristics of adaptable systems, and which ones can we then inoculate back into societal practice. And that's been the process of working with a lot of different life scientists and a lot of different security practitioners and theorists, everyone from the boots on the ground soldiers in Iraq to ministers in Department of Homeland Security and in Department of Defense, and we look at top to bottom how you would apply adaptability in the real world.
That's great, and actually we're doing something similar, which will appear in the economic section of Evolution, This View of Life, on looking to nature for insight on regulatory issues, such as regulating economic systems, which are also unpredictable. So there's a twin subject, basically, that we'll also be working on and covering. Well, how about observation and ecology?
Well, observation and ecology really builds out of my whole career. I've been an ecologist who has used observational data. That is, it's like found art, basically. It's data that you find, historical data, it's long-term monitoring data, it's comparing historical photos, any kind of data that really hasn't been manipulated directly for an experiment with a known hypothesis to start with. Now, when I was coming up as an ecologist, the experimental mode was the way that you did ecology. People routinely said, well, what experiments are you going to do? And I said, well, we really got to figure out how this system has changed, and the only way we can do that, because it's, say a large system, is go back to historical records, see what was living there, and see what's changed. And as I started doing this kind of research, digging up things like old gambling contests that guessed when the ice in the spring would melt up in Alaska that have been going on for 100 years. They turn out to be great records of climate change. I realized that there's this whole mode of doing science which isn't the acceptable in the mainstream mode of doing science, which means you have a falsifiable hypothesis that you test with a manipulative experiment.
Yeah, let me just insert something here, because my colleague Peter Turchin, whose work will appear on Evolution: This View of Life, is taking this approach to world history, and he finds wonderful databases like the one that you just described, which actually quantify historical change, even way back in ancient history. So that's a marvelous topic, which once again hops from topic to topic. You're doing it for the environment, but it can also be done for human history. So continue.
Absolutely, and I see this all across different fields. Some fields I find are getting away from an observational mode. International studies for a long time has abandoned the sort of go and study a country and compare it. Some fields like ecology, and this is why it's so exciting to be in ecology right now, are really getting back into this, and part of it is facilitated by amazing new technologies like remote sensing and genetics and animal-borne sensors, the critter cams you see on National Geographic, that allow us to do ecology on a scale unimaginable before. But I should caution that some of it is also opening up academic ecology to other forms of knowing and other ways that people understand ecological systems, like traditional ecological knowledge, local ecological knowledge, which is held by, for example, people like fishermen who spend every day out on the water and see those systems. And we're starting to realize how important that knowledge is. And then opening ecology by developing citizen science programs where people are going out when they visit a park or something. We're about to have a bio blitz at Saguaro Park here in Tucson where people are going to go out and just find every species they can find and record them. And those are great sources of observational data that tell us a lot about ecological systems in the present and can also tell us about systems in this changing era that we live in.
Well, I think just this short conversation provides a glimpse of what the magazine is all about and what your environment section is going to be all about. This is state-of-the-art science. It's as good as it gets as far as the basic science is concerned, and it is hugely relevant, and anyone can get interested in it. It's just plain fun and exciting. So that's what the magazine is all about, and I look forward to how you develop the environment section of Evolution, This View of Life. So thank you very much for this introductory video cast, and I will sign off for the moment for Evolution, This View of Life. Thank you very much.